In this video, I'm going to show you how I created a fold-down workbench and a pegboard to organize all of my tools. The first part of this video is going to focus on constructing that fold-down workbench, and then I'll finish up the video by constructing the pegboard. So let's get started. The first thing I'm going to talk about is the design of the workbench.
I wanted to make sure that my workbench was in a location where I would have easy access to electricity for my power tools. The only place in my garage that has power outlets is towards the front of the garage. And I knew I couldn't put a traditional workbench in that area because I also want to be able to park my cars in that space. So I decided that a fold-down workbench would be the best design option in order to accomplish those goals. With that decision made, the next step was to get to work measuring the space. I decided on a 5-foot long workbench that had a depth of 2.5 feet away from the wall, with a height of 3 feet from the floor. Next, I got on Amazon and went shopping for some heavy-duty brackets. I found these brackets that are rated at 550 pounds, which I figure would be sufficient for anything that I ever attempted to do.
Once you have your design planned out, it's time to start thinking about materials and tools that you're going to use on your build job. Here is a complete list of materials and tools that I used to help me make this workbench and pegboard. Once you have everything that you need, the next step is to start marking the measurements on the wall.
The front of my garage has a 3-inch step in the place where my workbench is going to go. And the thickness of the plywood that I purchased for this workbench was 1 inch. The original height that I wanted for my workbench was 36 inches. So from the top of the step, I measured 32 inches and marked the wall. Then I grabbed my level just to do a quick check and make sure that the marks that I made were nice and straight. I grabbed my stud finder in order to locate where the studs were behind the drywall. Since I'm planning on putting some weight on this workbench, and it will be heavily used, I wanted to make sure that it gets anchored into some studs as opposed to just screwing it into the drywall and using some wall anchors to hold it in place. Be sure to mark where the stud starts and stops on your wall. This will help you find the center of each stud. Next, I measured from the center of one stud to the center of the next stud to find the distance between them. Then I did a little math to figure out how much overhang there would be on the left and the right sides of the studs. I calculated this distance to be 13.75 inches. Then I took out my tape measure again and marked this 13.75 inch distance on both the left and the right sides of the stud. In this way, I'm able to see exactly where the workbench is going to fit on the wall. This next step is completely optional, so feel free to skip on to step 4 if you don't feel that you need this. Since the brackets are skinny and made of metal, I had some concerns that they might do some damage to my drywall as I was moving them up and down every time that I wanted to use my workbench. My plan to address this issue was just to make a little brace for the bracket to drill into so that it didn't directly press into my drywall. I lined up one of the brackets on a piece of scrap board from the plywood purchase for this project, and I started to take some measurements. I found that the side of the bracket that was going to be attached to the wall is 8 inches. So I added 2 inches to this length for a total of 10 inches. And I decided on a 4-inch wide piece. So the dimensions of this brace ended up being 10 inches tall and 4 inches wide. I wanted 2 of these, one for each bracket. I made my markings on the scrap piece of plywood and then proceeded to cut them out. I also decided to add a little decorative flair to these braces. So I cut the ends at 45-degree angles with my miter saw. And I also grabbed my router and dressed up the edges a bit just so that it looked a little more rounded and a little bit nicer, even though I was just using a scrap piece of plywood. Remember, if you're ever working with power tools, be safety conscious. Make sure you have glasses on to protect your eyes and earplugs in to protect your ears. Also, as soon as you're finished using a power tool, always remember to unplug it right away just to avoid any accidents in your workshop. For this next step, you're going to want to grab your sanding tool and sand all of the wood surfaces on this project. I sand using a two-step process. I'll start with a rough grit sandpaper first, like this one. And then I'll go again with a very fine grit sandpaper, just to make it nice and smooth to the touch. Don't forget to flip your board over and repeat this process on the back side. Plus, if you made any braces from step 3 of this project, go ahead and sand those down too. This next step is completely optional. I just wanted to jazz up my workbench a little bit by staining it a provincial wood stain color. And because I know I'm going to batter this thing up pretty well through my use of it, I wanted to also apply a sealer to protect it just a little bit more. If you prefer a natural wood finish, feel free to skip this step and move on to step number 6. Feel free to apply as many coats of stain as you like in order to get the desired finish. I usually apply 2 coats of stain in order to darken up the initial application. Don't forget to read the instructions on your jar of stain. It has helpful instructions on the amount of time that you should wait for the stain to dry in between each application. Then just flip the board over and get both sides. To seal this project, I'm using a warm satin polyurethane sealant. I apply this with a foam roller to get as smooth of a finish as possible. I usually apply at least 2 or 3 coats of sealer. In between each coat, I'll use an extremely fine grit sandpaper, like this one, and this just ensures that the surface is as smooth and glossy as possible. Now we're ready to start the process of installing the brackets into the wall. There are 3 pre-drilled holes in this bracket, so the first thing I did was line up the bracket in the center of the braces that I made. I used a tape measure just to confirm that the bracket was lined up in the center. Once everything was lined up, I traced the location of those holes so that I'd be able to see them on the brace. The kit for the brackets came with a set of screws for installation, but I did want to go ahead and pre-drill the holes for these screws. I selected a drill bit that perfectly matched the diameter of the screws, but was still small enough that the screw threads were still able to grab into the wall. I ended up using a 1/8 size drill bit. Then I used that drill bit to drill into the holes that I had previously marked on all of the braces. If you chose not to make braces, then you would do this same thing, but just against the wall itself. Next, I wanted to pre-drill into the wall using the markings that I had already made into the braces. So I lined up my drill marks with the center of one of the studs, used a level to double check that everything was lined up, and then drilled through the brace right into those pre-drilled holes so that I would have the same drill marks in the wall to use as a guide when I put this all together. Then I took my drill and drilled into each of those marks just to make sure that the drill did actually get into the stud itself, because my drill bit wasn't really that long. And now it's time to put it all together. So I used the screws that came with the kit to attach the bracket to the brace that I had made. I didn't drill these in all the way. Just think of getting the screws set into position so that when you drill it into the wall, it becomes a little easier. I also had a bit of trouble getting my drill to reach the screws on 2 of those locations, so I used a drill bit extender to help me out. And now I'm ready to drill this guy into the wall. I drilled the screws through a little bit so they poked out the backside, just so that I could line up the screws with the holes that I pre-drilled into the wall. Now just line those screws up, drill it into the wall. Be sure to check it with a level and tighten up those screws. After installing both brackets, I checked it with a level again, and it looks good. All that's left to do is grab the workbench surface itself and screw it into place. Make sure that it's lined up with the markings that you made earlier in step number 2 of this video, and then your table should be perfectly centered above those 2 brackets. I did decide to go ahead and pull the table away from the wall just a little bit so that when I'm folding it up and down, it doesn't leave any marks on the wall. Now it's time to use the smaller screws that came with the bracket kit and screw straight through the bracket up into the workbench. It might be helpful if you have another person to put some weight on the top of the workbench for you while you screw those screws up into the wood surface. The kit only came with 3 small screws for each bracket. However, there are 4 holes that are pre-drilled into each of them. So if you want, you can go buy an extra set of 2 screws that match the ones that came in the kit so that you can have as much support as possible for your workbench.
Do a quick test to make sure that everything's working. And it looks like we're in business. Moving on to the pegboard.
In this first step, I'm going to construct a frame that the pegboard will be screwed into. You want something that's going to prop the pegboard off of the wall at least a ½ an inch so that you can get your hooks into the pegboard without scratching up your wall. To save some money, I constructed this frame out of a scrap piece of plywood that I had from a previous project. I set my circular saw up with a guide so that my cuts would be exactly 1½ inches on each piece. If you don't have any scrap wood laying around to cut your own pieces, feel free to go and purchase some 1x2s. They would work really well for this project to construct the frame. Out of this 6-foot piece of plywood, I ended up cutting 4 1½ inch wide pieces for this project. Next, I took out my tape measure and started marking those boards to size. 2 of them would be the top and bottom of the frame, and I wanted those to be 5 feet long. I wanted the height of the frame to be 3 feet tall, or 36 inches. But when fitted together, the top and bottom pieces would take up 3 inches of this space. So I actually measured 33 inches on the smaller boards that would run the left side, center, and right side of the frame. It's critical that all of these boards be the same length. So to ensure this, I stacked them on top of each other, got the ends lined up as close as I could, and then ran my saw down both sides one more time just for good measure. And here's what we have so far. This next step that I'm going to run through is completely optional. Since I'm using a scrap piece of plywood, I just wanted to doctor up those boards a little bit so they looked a bit nicer for my project. So I got out my sander and I started sanding down those boards.
I also decided to stain the boards with a color that matches my workbench.
I'm using a provincial wood finish. When this stain dries completely, I'm going to finish it up with a polyurethane sealer. This way the stain won't leave marks on my wall when I get it installed. And now I'm ready to start installing the pegboard frame. I wanted mine to be about 3 inches above the height of my workbench. I marked the height and then grabbed my stud finder so that I could locate the studs behind the drywall. With this information, I started to develop my plan for installing the pegboard frame. The first board I'm going to install will be the one on the bottom. These blue circles represent the spots on the frame where I was able to locate a stud behind the wall with my stud finder. And I'm going to use 3-inch wood screws in order to secure the board in place in these spots. But I still wanted some added support at the very edges of the pegboard frame. Unfortunately, these spots did not have a stud behind the wall. So I'm going to use some heavy-duty wall anchors in these locations, and these are marked by the purple circles on the frame. Now on to installing that first board. The first thing I did was take out my level, line up my board with my marks on my wall, and drill some pilot holes so that I could see on the wall where everything was going to be screwed in. These are the heavy-duty wall anchors that I purchased for this project. On the package, it comes with directions about drill bit size that you should use for the anchors. So I took out my 5/16 inch drill bit and I widened those pilot holes so that the anchors would fit through the drywall. You have to squeeze each one of those wall anchors together so that they'll fit through the hole in your drywall. And then once you put a screw in through there, they'll expand on the back side of the wall. So grab your hammer and pound those wall anchors in there. The screws that came in the package with the wall anchors have a head on them that will stick up into my pegboard, and I didn't want that to happen. I want the pegboard to be flush against the frame, and so I chose to countersink those screws using the same 5/16 inch drill bit. You don't want to drill too deep. Just far enough that you can get the head of the screw to lie underneath the surface of the board. And here I am installing that board. Be sure to use a level to check your progress. Use those pilot holes that you drilled before as a guide to make sure that your board is in the proper place. Use the wall anchor screws to drill into your wall anchors, and I used 3-inch wood screws to drill directly into the studs. And now back to the drawing board. The next piece of frame that I'm going to install is going to be this orange piece, the very left side of the pegboard. There is no stud behind this piece, and so I needed to use the wall anchors again in order to secure the board against the wall. These locations are indicated by the purple circles again. I repeated the same process as on the first board. I placed the board, made sure it was straight with a level, and then took out my drill and made some pilot holes to mark its location into the wall. Widened the holes with the 5/16 inch drill bit, and then hammered in the wall anchors. I used the 5/16 inch drill bit to countersink the wall anchor screws. and then installed the board. Back to the drawing board again for the third piece. This will be the middle board that I've indicated in yellow. This board has a stud directly behind it, and so I just used 3-inch wood screws to attach it in the locations that are indicated with the blue circles. I used a level to ensure that the board was straight, drilled some pilot holes, and then screwed in those 3-inch wood screws. Back to the drawing board again one more time. Next, I'll install this green board at the top. Once again, the wall anchors are indicated with purple circles, and the 3-inch screws that are drilled directly into the studs are indicated with the blue circles. And the last piece, indicated in the black color, will have only wall anchors in it. Drill in your pilot holes for both of those boards. Widen the pilot holes that will have wall anchors drilled into them with the 5/16 inch drill bit, and then pound in your wall anchors. Don't forget to countersink your wall anchor screws. And then screw in those two pieces. Use the wall anchor screws into the wall anchors and the 3-inch wood screws into the studs. And now we're on to the final step. For this one, I needed an extra pair of hands to help me line up the pegboard against the frame and also hold it in place while I used 1/2-inch wood screws to secure the pegboard to the frame. I counted the number of peg holes across the pegboard and also up and down the pegboard so that I could evenly space my screws. And then I just made sure that the placement of the screws on the top side lined up with the placement on the bottom. And there you have it. Here is the installed pegboard. And now the fun part begins. Grab a pegboard organizing kit and start filling up your pegboard with all of your tools. If you found this video helpful, please hit that like button and consider subscribing to my channel. Happy DIYing!